Hello friends. November 4th, 1914, the British ship Endurance was making its way through stormy seas toward the world's most dangerous and mysterious continent, Antarctica. On board was a crew of 28 men, commanded by explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, a man determined to do something no one in history had ever accomplished before, to cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot. Yes, you heard that right, friends. In an age with no smartphones, no GPS, no modern technology, he planned to traverse this frozen continent from top to bottom, on foot, in -50°C, temperatures and brutal blizzards. His plan was to sail to the coast of Antarctica via the Weddell Sea. On the map, you can see exactly where they intended to land, and from there, they would trek to the South Pole, cross it, and continue all the way to the Ross Sea. The total journey was about 2,900 kilometers. And if everything went according to plan, it would take around 120 days. But how badly this plan would fail, and what they would have to endure afterward, was beyond anything they could imagine, and beyond anything you can imagine to friends. On November 5th, 1914, Endurance reached a whaling station on South Georgia Island, the last human settlement on their route. Looking at the map, this group of islands lies near the tip of South America. Below, it juts out the Antarctic Peninsula, next to the Weddell Sea, a sea almost completely surrounded by land. Because of its geography, ice here doesn't easily drift away, forming a dense, permanent layer. That day, the weather was terrible, and the Weddell Sea's conditions were just as bad. Locals warned Shackleton to delay the mission. Postpone it, they said, because going there in these conditions will be extremely risky. But Shackleton, stubborn as ever, insisted, "It doesn't matter, we move forward." On December 5th, 1914, Endurance continued on, but soon, the fear of the locals proved right. The ice in the Weddell Sea was far thicker and denser than expected. Still, Shackleton pressed on. By January 18th, 1915, after skirting the edges of the ice for some time, the ship became completely trapped. A few days later, some crew members spotted a 15-foot crack in the ice about 50 yards from the ship. This small gap was their last hope of escape. They ran the ship's engines at full power for 3 hours, trying to break free, but the vessel didn't budge an inch. Crew members got out and tried cutting the ice with axes and chisels. No luck. The ice floe they were stuck in began drifting farther from land. Their intended landing point, Rossel Bay, was now 60 miles away, and even if they wanted to walk there, open water lay in between. The ship couldn't move, and they couldn't reach shore. Weeks turned into months. Winter in Antarctica was approaching, and winter here meant 24 hours of darkness for weeks and months on end, with not a single minute of sunlight. Shackleton ordered the crew to spend the winter aboard the ship, but winter also meant colder temperatures, heavy snow, and fierce blizzards. Gradually, the pressure of the ice increased around the hull. Frank Hurley, the expedition photographer, documented the ordeal. The photos show the ice gripping the ship tighter and tighter. By September 30th, 1915, cracks were visible along the ship's sides. Still, the crew held on to hope. Then, on October 24th, 1915, at 6:45 p.m., the pressure suddenly split the ice, and a chunk crashed into the Endurance, breaking its stern post. Water began flooding in. The crew immediately went to work, pumping water out for 3 days straight. But more was coming in than they could remove. Outside, men hacked away at the ice pressing against the hull, but it didn't help. Temperatures were -8.5°C, 17 degrees Fahrenheit, yet no one panicked. Finally, Shackleton gave the order, "Abandon ship." Crewman Tom McLeod, surveying the situation, said, "I don't think we'll ever get home again." The Endurance had now been trapped for over 9 months. On October 27th, 1915, a loud cracking noise rang out. Shackleton turned and saw something shocking. The stern of the ship had risen 20 feet into the air. The rudder and stern post tore free, wooden beams splintered, and water rushed into the bow. Thankfully, everyone had already evacuated. Soon the freezing water turned to ice, forcing the bow downward. Shackleton's dream of crossing Antarctica on foot sank along with his ship. Now, a more urgent question arose. Could they survive long enough to return home? They had no radio, no telephone, no way to contact the outside world. They were adrift on a floating ice floe in the Antarctic Ocean, one that was itself slowly drifting away. They pitched camp on a large, flat-iced hummock. Taking stock of their supplies, they found they had 3 small boats, 1 sledge, some personal belongings, and about 1 month's worth of food. At night, space was so tight that some men had to sleep directly on the ice, huddling together for warmth. The chance of any passing ship finding them here was essentially zero. No other vessels sailed these waters. It had been over a year since they had seen another human being. The outside world had no idea if they were even alive. Shackleton's only resources now were his skill and experience. But how long could those keep the crew alive? When food ran short, what then? Even their ice camp was unstable. The floe could break up at any time. They needed solid ground. Shackleton calculated that the nearest land was Paulet Island, about 550 kilometers away at the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. Ironically, in 1903, after a Swedish ship had been trapped in ice, rescue gear was stored on Paulet Island for future emergencies. Gear Shackleton himself had purchased. Now, 12 years later, his life might depend on it. He decided they would attempt to reach Paulet Island. All supplies would be hauled on sledges across the ice. Shackleton ordered that each man could carry only 2 pounds of personal belongings. "Nothing is more valuable than your life," he told them. He left behind his own gold coins and Bible in the snow. Photographer Frank Hurley had around 400 negatives, but was forced to choose only 152 carry. These images would later become the historic record of the expedition. Within weeks, food shortages forced them to kill the puppies from the sled dogs. A heartbreaking decision, but survival left no choice. When they finally set out, each boat weighed about a ton, making progress painfully slow, especially as summer returned, softening the ice surface. After 3 hours of hauling, they had covered only 1 mile. Conditions worsening, Shackleton decided to camp again, waiting for the floe to drift closer to land. They named their new camp Ocean Camp. Shackleton gave every man tasks to keep them busy and to fight off depression. Then, on November 21, 1915, more ice pressure struck the Endurance's remains. The stern heaved into the air, hovered for a moment, and then the entire ship sank beneath the ice. The crew was only a few kilometers away, close enough to witness the end of their ship, and the symbolic end of their original mission. They watched it sink right before their eyes. Even though the ship had already been abandoned, seeing it go down like that hit them with a deep emotional shock, as if the last link to the outside world had just been severed. Now, all they had left was a drifting chunk of ice and the camp they had built on it, Ocean Camp. For the next few days, things were relatively stable. But a few weeks later, the floe suddenly began drifting east, carrying them farther from land. On December 23, 1915, Shackleton decided to abandon Ocean Camp and try marching again. But only a few kilometers in, they came across dangerously thin ice and open water. Forward progress was impossible, and going back wasn't an option either. So they set up camp again, this time on a new ice floe. With food running low, Shackleton enforced strict rationing. Each man got 1 biscuit per day, a little diluted milk, some cocoa, and a tiny amount of high-fat canned meat paste. Whenever seals or penguins appeared, the men hunted them for extra food. The truth was, there still wasn't enough. But Shackleton often lied about the quantities to keep morale up. "Don't worry," he'd say, "there's enough to keep us alive." He knew that if they were going to survive, it could take a very long time, and mental strength would be just as important as physical endurance. For months, the men stayed on this new floe. Thankfully, it drifted in a favorable direction. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and before they knew it, the new year had arrived. On the morning of March 23, 1916, Shackleton spotted something through the fog. As it lifted, mountains came into view. He recognized them as belonging to Joinville Island. But this wasn't good news. Joinville lay far to the northeast, meaning they had drifted so far that Paulet Island was now behind them. Joinville was only about 57 miles from Paulet, but it was 90 off to the west, with vast fields of ice in between, making it impossible to reach. Studying the map, Shackleton saw that if they kept drifting north, there were only two more islands in their path, Clarence Island and Elephant Island. After that, there would be nothing but open ocean for thousands of kilometers. The deadly Drake Passage. The Drake Passage, between the southern tip of South America and the northern tip of Antarctica, is the most dangerous sea in the world. Waves there can reach 12 meters high, and over 20,000 sailors have died in its waters. More than 800 ships have sunk there in recorded history. Even today, in 2025, crossing it by ship means facing terrifying seas that can shake even the largest cruise liners. Shackleton knew, if his crew reached the Drake Passage on an ice floe, their deaths would be certain. Meanwhile, the food shortage was getting worse. Even the rotting meat they'd set aside for the dogs had to be inspected, and the less rancid portions given to the men to eat. For drinking water, each person would fill a small can with ice and keep it against their body to melt, yielding only a spoonful or two at a time. Interestingly, though there were officially 28 people in the crew, there were only supposed to be 27. Back in August 1914, when the ship left Britain, a man named Blackborough had stowed away after Shackleton had refused to take him on. When he was discovered, Shackleton told him bluntly, "If we ever run out of food, you'll be the first one eaten." If you remember the miracle of Flight 571 story I told in another video, you'll know some groups have had to make that horrific choice. Thankfully, Shackleton's crew never had to. Their luck turned when they spotted a leopard seal. Killing it gave them nearly 1,000 pounds of meat. Some crew even slaughtered their sled dogs for food. For the next few months, at least, hunger wasn't an issue. On April 7, 1916, drifting on the ice, they finally spotted Clarence Island, about 83 kilometers to the north. It gave them a burst of hope, until the wind suddenly shifted east. Eastward, there were no more islands, no land, nothing but open water. In just a few hours, their hopes were shattered. The floe they were camped on was also breaking apart, now only about 50 meters long. Staying there was becoming dangerous. Shackleton decided to load all 28 men into 3 small boats and aim for Clarence Island. The water ahead wasn't just open sea. It was choked with smaller floes and towering icebergs. After a while, they found another sturdy floe and stopped to make camp again. But soon, a crack appeared in it, and suddenly, one of the crew, fireman Ernest, fell into the icy water. The men scrambled to pull him out, but before they could get organized, the floe split in two. Shackleton was stranded alone on one half, while the rest of the crew drifted away in the darkness on the other. No one knew what to do. Their leader, the man giving orders all this time, had vanished into the night. Then, out of the darkness, Shackleton's voice rang out. The men quickly launched a boat and brought him back. Back on the main floe, Shackleton's first question was about Ernest. He was still shivering violently, dangerously close to hypothermia. There was no way to light a fire. If nothing was done, he'd be dead within hours. Shackleton used his experience and ordered Ernest to keep walking all night, until his body heat was strong enough to dry his clothes. The poor man walked and walked for hours, but eventually his clothes dried, his shivering stopped, and he survived. Meanwhile, the wind kept changing direction, sending their floe drifting first one way, then another. They changed their target 4 times. At first, they thought they'd head for Clarence Island. Then they decided on King George Island. Later, they changed course again, toward Hope Bay, and finally, they decided to drift toward Elephant Island. Elephant Island was the last island before Drake Passage about 160 kilometers to the northwest, because their iceberg was drifting north. The further north they went, the warmer it got. The temperature had now risen to -8 degrees Celsius, and the surrounding ice was breaking up. But less ice also meant less fresh water. Supplies were running out fast. Everyone's lips were swollen and cracked from thirst, and their throats were so dry it was hard to swallow food. To help them choke it down, they were given raw seal meat, so the blood in it would make swallowing easier. Slowly, their chunk of ice drifted closer to Elephant Island, now only 50 kilometers away. Shackleton gave the order to put the boats in the water for the final leg of the journey. On April 15, 1916, the crew could hardly believe their luck. All 3 boats reached the island safely. After 497 days, they finally felt solid ground under their feet, not shifting ice. But Elephant Island was nothing like paradise. The place was uninhabited, bare, windswept lump of rock. There were no supplies, no way to contact anyone, and its location was so remote that no ships ever passed nearby. They were still stuck with the same problem: how to get home. Shackleton studied the map and saw 3 options: sail northwest about 800 kilometers to Cape Horn, the southern tip of South America; sail east to the Falkland Islands, about 880 kilometers away; sail northeast to South Georgia Island, about 1,300 kilometers away, and tried to get help there. The first 2 were closer, but both meant crossing the infamous Drake Passage, one of the most dangerous stretches of sea on Earth. Shackleton chose the third option, believing the wind and currents would be more in their favor. The crew's condition was too poor to take everyone. Shackleton decided to take just 5 men with him in a small boat to South Georgia and find help. The others would set up camp and wait on Elephant Island. On April 24, 1916, Shackleton and his small team set out. Their route still meant skirting part of the Drake Passage. In their tiny hand-powered boat, they entered one of the world's most treacherous waterways. To cover the enormous distance, they rowed in shifts for hours rowing, for hours resting. But resting meant lying in a cramped, wet boat, constantly soaked by freezing waves, seasick and exhausted. It was late April winter in Antarctica. The sun came out for only a few hours each day, which was critical because they used a sextant during those brief daylight moments to check their course. Day after day, night after night, they pushed on. Waves often flooded the boat, forcing them to pump water out. More than once, giant waves nearly capsized them. They ate lying down because there was no space to sit up, and Shackleton himself began to lose hope. One day, a small bird hovered over the boat, and Shackleton, frustrated and on edge, found himself cursing at it. But after days of misery, they finally came within 3 miles of South Georgia. Before they could celebrate, a violent storm hit. The boat was tossed around like a toy, and the men, too weak to fight anymore, put down their oars and waited for the end. But hours later, the winds eased, the clouds broke, and they saw its South Georgia Island just a mile away. The sight lit a spark in them. Every man grabbed an oar, rowing with whatever strength they had left. The waves were still fierce, and Shackleton feared they wouldn't make it, but slowly they inched forward. After 3 relentless weeks, battling storms, cold, and exhaustion, they finally made landfall on May 10, 1916, to 522 days. After leaving this very island at the start of their expedition, they embraced each other in relief. But the fight wasn't over. South Georgia was over 100 kilometers long, and they had landed on the opposite side from the whaling station, the only inhabited place on the island. 2 options: sail the battered boat 130 miles around the coast or cross the island on foot. The land route was only 29 miles, but no one had ever crossed the island before. It was considered impossible. Towering, icy mountains blocked the way. Sailing was out, the boat was too damaged. On foot it would have to be. Shackleton wasn't one to give up, especially not now. On May 19, 1916, at 3 a.m., Shackleton set out with 2 men, Worsley and Crean. They left their sleeping bags behind to move faster. They had no map, no known route. Snow was knee-deep, and peaks blocked their view. They climbed one mountain after another, often finding sheer cliffs or deep chasms on the other side and having to turn back. Finally, after scaling every visible peak, they faced a massive drop, a dangerous, icy slope. Turning back was no longer an option. They tied themselves together with a rope and began slowly cutting steps into the ice, inching their way down. Hours later, they spotted the Stromness whaling station and people. After 36 continuous hours of climbing, on May 20th, 1916, Shackleton, Worsley and Crean became the first to cross the Allardyce mountain range and reach Stromness. No one in history had ever crossed South Georgia Island on foot. What Shackleton and his men pulled off was considered impossible. You can get a sense of just how impossible it was from the fact that the next time anyone managed to do it was in 1955, nearly 40 years later, and those were expert climbers with full gear. Shackleton had no tent, no sleeping bag, just raw courage, determination, and sheer stubbornness. When Shackleton and his 2 companions finally reached the whaling station, they were almost unrecognizable as human beings. Their beards were huge, their faces blackened from frostbite and sunburn, and only their eyes were visible. Their clothes were shredded. The factory manager took one look and realized who he was, Shackleton, the man who had vanished in Antarctica with his crew 2 years earlier. Everyone at the South Georgia station knew the story. To them, Shackleton was a tragic figure who had gone down with his ship, and now here he was, standing alive before them. The manager immediately gave them food, clean clothes, and beds for the night. The 3 men washed, shaved, and rested. The very next day, Worsley took a boat to King Haakon Bay to rescue the 3 men still waiting on the far side of the island. But Shackleton's real worry was for the 22 men still stranded on Elephant Island. It had been more than a month since he'd last seen them. Were they even still alive? Think about it, could you stay motivated to live in such conditions, not knowing if your captain had even survived the Drake Passage, or if help was ever going to come? Before leaving, Shackleton had put Frank Wild in charge of the Elephant Island group. He knew they would need leadership to keep from slipping into despair. Under Wild's orders, they flipped 2 boats upside down to make a shelter. For 128 days, they lived there, hunting penguins and seals to survive. Every morning, Frank Wild told them the same thing. Pack up, boys. The boss could come today. The boss was Shackleton, but the boss didn't come. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Still, every morning, Wild climbed a hill to look for a ship, and every evening he returned empty. 4 months in, morale was starting to collapse. One man, Blackborough, developed severe gangrene in his foot, and they had to amputate it. With every passing day, the men became more convinced Shackleton hadn't made it to South Georgia, that he and the boat had gone down somewhere along the way. It had been for months and 6 days since Shackleton left. Wild finally decided they had to move on. The men packed their things not to wait for rescue, but to try to sail themselves to Deception Island. But before they could leave, they saw something in the distance, a large ship heading their way. It was the Yelcho sent by the Chilean government. As it drew closer, they saw their commander Shackleton standing on deck. Shackleton was stunned. All 22 men were alive. None of them had given up. After nearly 2 years battling ice, ocean, and mountains, Shackleton and his entire crew returned home. He had left with 27 men and returned with all 27 alive. It was nothing short of a miracle made possible by Shackleton's leadership, his crew's determination, and unbreakable teamwork. Fast forward 106 years. In 2022, a team of investigators searching the Weddell Sea spotted something 10,000 feet down Shackleton's ship, the Endurance. The preservation was extraordinary. The cold Antarctic waters had kept it almost perfectly intact, free from wood-eating parasites. The images they captured are stunning, like the ship had only recently sunk. And today, if you ever visit South Georgia Island, you can see Shackleton's grave there. He had set out to become the first man to cross Antarctica on foot. He failed at that mission but accomplished something far greater, something even more miraculous.